Hello, my name is Jordan Plikerd. I am a mechanical engineer from Cincinnati, Ohio. I did my internships with CSX Transportation, and then eventually, after graduating, joined Norfolk Southern in the mechanical department, freight car and locomotive maintenance and operations. So today, I'm just going to dive very briefly into the history of the U.S. railroads and pretty much where they have been and where they are going. So the U.S. Hey,
Good evening. I beg your
uh,
pardon. My internet has been down all day, but
yeah.
welcome, Jordan. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I beg your pardon, everybody, for being late to this. Jordan, take it away.
So yeah, the U.S. It has a very complicated history of the railroads, involving everything from scandals to politics to immigration, and it's really how the U.S. economy moves goods across a very very vast distance. So if we could go ahead and begin the presentation.
Jordan, the presentation's up.
So yes, the America's freight rail industry has about 225,000 kilometers of private rail. That is about 60% of the way to the moon. When you're looking at the U.S., you need to try to remember that approximately two-thirds of the population live on the East Coast, and a third of the population lives in the rest of the country. So you can really see where the U.S. has population centers by where the rail lines come together. Um, there was a great deal of railroad building before the U.S. Civil War, and the railroads were really the dominant means of transportation until after World War II. During times of war, the federal government has taken control of the railroad as a public sector utilities, and basically it was deemed a essential part of the war effort. After World War II, demand shifted. There were mergers. There was a lot of reform and a lot of technological advances. Next. So really, the transportation in the U.S. really began as canals. You had a lot of rivers in the U.S., and the U.S. was very much blessed with rivers for transportation of goods. But that wasn't really good enough. So a lot of canals, as you can see, were trying to bridge between the rivers and the Great Lakes. And railroads really came about because of the canals. So you would dig the canal, and then you would have horses pull these barges up and down the canals. And eventually they're like, hey, these horses are not efficient. We see these things that are making in England, using, steam, and we could pull the barges with that. And then after they tried that for a little while, they're like, hey, we really don't need the canal. Let's just do a railroad. And that's essentially how the US progressed from canals to railroads. Next. So in the age of steam, so back in the like 1802, very turn of the century, the British were experimenting and came up with a couple different types of locomotives. Now these boilers, steam boilers, tended to explode a lot. They were not very safe, and it was a lot of trial and error. Back in the day, they used to use wood boilers, and then they eventually, started using coal. But as you can see from these graphics of the original locomotives, they're basically just a steam boiler on wheels. They were incredibly dangerous. But after about 1830, the U.S. actually started manufacturing our own locomotives, no longer importing them from England. Next. So this is the standard, steam locomotive when we look at it, when we think of like the Great Train Robbery and other aspects of that time. Essentially, you had a engineer who was, moving all the levers. You had a boilerman who was, taking coal and throwing it into the locomotive. So essentially, every locomotive was two separate cars. You had the actual locomotive, and then you had the tender car, and then tender car carried your water to make that was going to become steam in your fuel source. These things, monstrous amount of power for back in the day, and incredibly dangerous. If you didn't have enough water, if you had too much fuel, over time these boilers would explode and basically kill everyone on board. It was not the safest mode of transportation, but it was very efficient for the time. Next. Really hoping this slide works. So this kind of shows you as basically you create steam and that pushes the pin rod to move the wheels. So this is one of the better graphics I could find about how a steam locomotive actually worked, because this was direct drive from the steam to push the piston that pushed onto the wheels that made you go. All right, next slide. So one of the great feats of the 1800s was the Transcontinental Railroad. Essentially, after the Civil War ended, you had a lot of people trying to get out west, and it used to take 6 weeks by horse and buggy to cross all the streams, ford all the rivers, and finally get to California, because you had the gold rush, you had a lot of other things going on in those days, and you had a lot of people trying to get out to the West Coast. There were two companies in charge of building this. It was Union Pacific and Central Pacific. Basically, the U.S. government granted them money per mile and all the land surrounding the tracks, um, and that caused some issues. People pretty much, were incentivized to not make the railroad straight, but to take a lot of twists and turns. And it eventually got done in Proximatory Point, Utah, in May 10th, 1869. This was considered the first live event in U.S. history. You had telegraphs that were built along the railroad that could send the message that it was completed. You had cannons blasting off in New York City. You had a parade in Chicago. The Liberty Bell was ringing in Philly, because this was such a big deal, because it used to take 6 months to cross the U.S. Now you could cross it in one week. Um, I mean, this wasn't without scandal, of course, but this was a big improvement that the U.S. was really one nation now, with a backbone of steel, as some have put it over the years. Next. So one of the major contributors to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was about 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese immigrants. They've pretty much been ignored in history, but you had all these Chinese immigrants that were brought over to build this railroad. It was a very hard life. They had next to no benefits. They worked anywhere from blacksmithing to tunneling to carpentry, using explosives, laying timber. Um, they were there. They built the U.S. infrastructure. Next. So this is a picture from 1869, and you can kind of see in the uh, in the lower right hand corner. Um, we assume they were two Chinese laborers because of their hats. But among those who worked on this railroad building the U.S. infrastructure were the Irish that had immigrated to the U.S. after the potato famine. Um, they, the U.S., when we look at our infrastructure, was built kind of on the backs of immigrants, and the Irish and the Chinese were joined by free slaves, joined by Mormons and other European immigrants. This was a monumental feat that took, tens of thousands of people and years to build. But once it was, that infrastructure really connected the states. So one of the interesting scandals that happened during this time during the Grant presidency. Essentially, in 1867, there was a fraudulent company called Credit Mobile. Mobile. It's a French name. I'm mispronouncing it. I'm sorry. But essentially, the railroads said, "Hey, we're just going to create this fake construction company and charge ourselves double, and then we're going to use that money to bribe Congress and pay ourselves." So basically, the construction company Credit Mobiler charged $94 million to Union Pacific, and Union Pacific pocketed $44 million in profit that the U.S. taxpayers paid for. And then they took some of this profit and bribed U.S. congressmen. And when it finally got known what had happened, a third of the congressmen got voted out that election because this scandal just completely rocked the U.S. population. That the corporations and uh, the U.S. government could be in cahoots and just run against each other. Um, so that was one of the major scandals during the Grant presidency, and this really affected the U.S. viewpoint on big business for quite a while. But also, once the U.S. was connected, uh, the U.S. had a huge issue because people were running into each other on the trains. So the U.S. actually created four time zones that were set up according to the sun, and this became the standard U.S. time. Was that the railroads made the U.S. Get on time because railroads have to operate on a schedule. For you don't want two trains on the same track at the same time. It doesn't work out well. Next. So let's talk about the actual physical railroad. So the rails, where everything goes on, steel wheels on steel rails, very efficient. But once you had a connected U.S., every railroad back in the day used to basically build their own equipment. Um, every track was a different length, and this was horrible because you couldn't just move from A to Z. You had to stop at B, you had to stop at C, and you had to keep reloading your freight into somebody else's car for that section of line. So eventually, in 1886, you had standard gauge day, where every piece of rail in the US was moved to have 4 feet, 8.5 inches in between the rails. So 1,435 millimeters. So this was a big deal because then you could operate equipment across the US. You didn't have to stop and reload anything. Next. So the actual freight cars that pull or hold all the American freight, you have the box car, and some of these, they can carry anything from pallets of beer, uh, anything you can put in a box can go on there. You even have refrigerated box cars to haul meat and produce around the U.S. You have flat cars where anything that is too large to actually fit in a car that you probably need to put on there with a crane, that can be aircraft fuselages, the main body of airplanes like 747s go on there. Actual military tanks fit on there. You have gondola, not the most complicated system, but with this large scale piece of equipment that's moving on you, um, it's incredibly heavy duty. The fuel tank is probably 3,000 gallons of diesel fuel most of the time. You have a giant air compressor on the locomotives that's powered by the electric alternator that powers the air brakes on the locomotive. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But essentially, diesel locomotives came about in the 1920s as an alternative to steam power. They provided greater flexibility, performance than steam. You didn't have to carry around and refill all this water and your fuel all the time. It was much easier logistically. They had lower operating costs and lower maintenance costs. So essentially, after World War II, these things became the de facto standard across the U.S. Next. So as they began, shipping uh, equipment across the U.S., the idea came about. Let's have a single container that can be shipped by sea, by rail, and by truck. And some people refer to these as Connex boxes. I was trained to call these intermodal containers because they are any mode of transportation. So essentially, the Army Corps of Engineer came up and said, "Hey, we're tired of transloading all this stuff on from a ship to a train to a truck. Let's just have a standard container, and everyone, matches this container, and you just move the container from A to B, and you're done." This has created a lot of efficiency in the transportation system. Um, Next slide. With this transportation system where things can go on truck to ship um, to rail, you really found it very easy to move items across the world, and the transportation costs became so low that really, with globalization, you had to compete. What's interesting in the U.S. market, though, is that as China is closest to California for most of the goods that we're importing, uh, that's not where the freight really wants to go. The freight wants to go to the East Coast where most of the people are. So the question always is it going to go to California, be transloaded onto um, a train, shipped most of the way there, and then put on a truck for the final mile? Or is it going to go through the Panama Canal and just, go straight to the people that it needs to go to, where most of the consumers are? So, this kind of balancing act of whatever the Panama Canal is charging versus what the railroads are charging the US, they really keep each other in check on what somebody can charge. Because if Panama Canal starts charging too much, then the railroads will benefit as more freight comes their way. And with larger volumes, you have better scales of efficiency. Next. So you can see here, this is a map of the freight railroads in the US. Now, the big ones are pretty much, they refer to them as Class 1 railroads. You have CSX and Norfolk Southern on the East Coast. And then basically you have Kansas City Southern, which is actually the smallest of the major players, and it goes from Kansas City up to Chicago pretty much. And then on the West Coast, you have Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BNSF, and you have Union Pacific. And then in Canada, uh, you have Canadian National and Canadian Pacific. Now, there are a lot of smaller railroads that meet niche markets, but these are the big players when it comes to the freight industry in the US. If I would have to guess, they own 90 to 95% of all the actual rail in the US. Um, Next. Next. All right. There. So let's talk about how something actually gets from A to B. So you have all these goods and goods that you're trying to move across the U.S. And a railroad will pick them up at point A, and it'll have a train of 150 cars a mile long, and each of those are going to a different destination. So you have a couple different things you can do. You can have basically a flat switch yard that is basically just a ton of tracks, and you move each car one by one or block by block to where it needs to go, and then that line is going to go to Baltimore, and then it'll be reclassified there, and then from there it will go to upstate New York, or it will go down to the Carolinas. One of the more interesting ways of classifying freight cars And try to picture this as basically a Amazon distribution center, but where you have 40-foot to 60-foot freight cars that are just gigantic packages you're trying to sort. So in a hump yard, it's basically on a hill. You have a locomotive that pushes the train slowly over the hill. You then have a guy that disconnects each and every freight car, and they then roll down the hill. And it's called a hump yard, the hill, or a gravity yard. So what's and this is where technology really has come in handy, is that there's a unique identifier on every car, and it gets scanned. So then the computer knows to automatically switch all the switches in that yard, and it'll go to one of, say, 42 tracks, because that track is going to this city and the other track's going to this city. So automatically route that freight car to the right track to go to the right city. But the issue is you really can't have this thing slamming into the next car. So the computer knows how many cars are in that track, and it knows you want to couple the cars together at about 5 miles an hour. So and it knows how much that car weighs, and it will actually put pressure on the side of the wheels, and they refer to this as a retarder. And it pushes with pneumatics against the wheel, and it slows it down so the car will slowly roll in the track it's supposed to go and couple at 5 miles an hour, so it doesn't damage the equipment and it doesn't damage the goods inside. Next. So, about in the 1880s, the US government stepped in and said, we need to have price controls on the railroads. They're really becoming too powerful. They're not being, they're, it's too expensive for some companies. So they put a lot of regulations into the railroad in the late 1800s. And then this was pretty much considered a time of stagnation. The railroads really didn't improve. They really didn't do much during this time. And then in 1980, they passed the Staggers Rail Act that deregulated the U.S. market when it came to freight railroad. So the freight railroads then could actually say, "Oh, I don't have to do the standard cost of A to B, because you're a hazmat load. You are so much more of a risk, and it's not worth it for me to actually haul your goods or services." So when they deregulated the market, deregulated the railroad industry, productivity went up, volume went up, revenue went up. Rates technically went down, but that's some have argued that that is because a lot of freight shouldn't have been moving on the rails to begin with. And they then went to other modes of transportation, whether it was barge or truck. But the Staggers Rail Act really re-energized the freight railroads in the U.S. So let's talk about some interesting safety issues when it comes to the rail industry. Next. I don't know if any of you saw this, but there was a movie called Unstoppable with Denzel Washington and Chris Pine. It was actually based on a true story, but not nearly to the extent that the movie made it out to be. There is a dead man switch on a locomotive, and it will stop a locomotive. If something happens, the locomotive actually will stop itself. The problem is that the locomotive was pushed all the way to max power, and the brakes were not connected. So you did have a runaway train. Now this really does not happen anymore, but this train pulling 47 cars up to 82 kilometers an hour, was just running by itself with no one on it in Ohio. Um, Back in 2001, but it was safely stopped. They just pulled up a locomotive behind it, applied the brakes at a crossing. Engineer got on the train master got on the locomotive and shut it down. But uh, it was cool enough that Denzel Washington made a movie about it. Next. So this is a very bad derailment that happened in 2005. This was on Norfolk Southern. This was in Graniteville, Carolina. Essentially, two cars containing liquid chlorine ruptured, releasing a poisonous chlorine cloud. Nine people were killed, and over 550 were injured, and this town had to be evacuated. So there are a lot of very dangerous chemicals being pulled right next to a lot of major cities in the U.S., and a lot of people really don't realize it. But because of this, because of hauling dangerous chemicals like this, typically railroads try to price themselves out of the market because they do not want to take the risk. Next. This is called the Chatsworth train collision. A Union Pacific freight train and a Metrolink hit head on at a red signal. Essentially, the engineer wasn't paying attention and he was texting on his phone. They say don't text and drive. Well, don't text and operate heavy machinery, and especially passengers in a pedestrian train. 25 people were killed in this because somebody was not paying attention to their job. Next. So one of the fundamental railroad safety devices, and this has not changed in 100 and some years. This is the Westinghouse three-way valve. Essentially, the locomotive has an air compressor on it, and they have air tanks on every freight car. And there's a pneumatic hose that connects every freight car to every one of those and connects to the locomotive. And to apply the brakes, you release air in the train line. So once you release air in the train line, the air in each individual car reservoir has more pressure than the air in the train line, and the brakes automatically apply. So this three-way valve basically stopped runaway trains completely. It was a simple design, and Westinghouse was a genius, and he saved thousands of lives with this design. Next. So in the chat, the B&O that actually integrated into the CSX eventually because of all the mergers. So B&O is now CSX. So every current railroad has this history of every railroad they used to be, and B&O, the Baltimore and Ohio, is now CSX. So one of the iconic things about looking at a freight railroad train is the caboose. And the cabooses are no more. They got replaced with this little tiny device on the back. Basically, it's wirelessly controlled from the locomotive, and they can brake the train from the back to spread out the train when you're trying to apply a braking position to really spread out your freight cars. This, used to be three people, three union employees in a caboose on every single train. And this little tiny device replaced them all, and it made the railroad safer by having fewer people involved that could get hurt. This has been a great device. It's not been popular with the people who lost their jobs, but it's worked out well for the freight railroads. One interesting thing that they're looking at doing now and is mandatory, it's called positive train control. Basically, it's a system that knows where the locomotive and train is, puts in a lot of fail safes that really takes out human error. Um, you have to know the location, the direction, the speed, but it's not. It's a technology that's being worked on still, and it's not fully implemented yet. Next. So dispatch center. So every train company has a dispatch center or several dispatch centers where they control their trains via radio, and they'll talk to their conductors. They'll drop signals, they'll raise signals, but they're really in connection with their crew, the locomotive engineer and conductor, and they really see how things are operating and to make sure that people are operating safely, the operating speeds. These are the brains of the railroad to make sure that, you know, one, priority traffic gets the priority. Two, things don't crash into each other. I mean, that's essentially what they're doing. Um, but yeah, they're talking to 20 different trains at a time. They are just wonderful people who have be very much able to set their mind on a single task and then move on. It's a very demanding job being a dispatcher. Next. So signals and crossings. These things will make no sense because they're different based on whatever the predecessor railroad used to be. There are B&O signals. There are Southern Railway signals. There are Norfolk Western signals. There's Burlington Northern signals. There's Santa Fe signals. And you just have to know the territory because each of these light patterns means a different thing to the train crew. So this is a visual representation to the train operator, the conductor and engineer of what's coming up. Do you have authority to go onto the track? Do you need to be prepared to slow down? Do you have the high ball and you're just on a mail train and you're cruising at 70 miles per hour as fast as you can go? But the signals in the US are a mess because everyone is different based on what that track used to be. Next. So let's talk about who makes these locomotives because freight cars, not that sexy. Now, locomotives, a little bit more so. So the old companies that used to make locomotives were GE and GM. GM became EMD, and then Caterpillar bought EMD. GE sold most of their stuff off to Wabtec. So these are just the companies in the U.S. that still make freight locomotives. There's only two left. They're in the U.S. EPA regulates the efficiencies that these locomotives have to be, and they have gotten very efficient over the years. Trains on average can move 1 ton of freight, 2,000 pounds. So that's roughly 1,000 kilograms, 500 miles on a single gallon of fuel. They're one of the most efficient modes of transportation, and that's due to the low coefficient of friction between the steel wheels and the steel rails. Next. So there's a couple different types of locomotives. I know that in Azerbaijan, I see a lot of electric locomotives with the overhead gantries that take the power that go into the locomotive and feed the motors directly. On the U.S., you mostly see this on commuter trains, city trains. These are not city to city destination types of transportation. This is to basically keep emissions down in cities where you're producing power from a power plant, be it coal, uh, be it green, solar, or wind. Um, and this is just one mode of transportation for electric locomotives. They are as environmentally friendly as the electricity to produce the train is. Next. So Norfolk Southern and a couple other railroads were investigating using battery locomotives instead of diesel locomotives. The problem with these, you really have to spend a lot of time charging. Basically, you can use it for an 8 hour shift, and then the next two shifts it has to sit in charge. So there's a lot of money tied up in a locomotive. These things cost, $3 to $6 million a piece. So a locomotive that you can only use a third of the time, it has some operating hurdles to accomplish. But they are looking at other modes of transportation, other forms of energy to power. the freight moving across the U.S. to be as green to the environment, but also green to the bottom line and saving money. Next. So some railroads, Russia and the U.S. are experimenting with compressed natural gas locomotives, and these almost harken back to the old steam car days that you have a car, a tender car, carrying all the fuel. So your actual locomotive is just the controls and the brakes and everything else, the air compressor, and then you'd have all this nat in the engine, and then you have a natural gas supply of compressed natural gas feeding into that engine to produce electricity to run your train. So these are being experimented with at the moment. Nothing much has come of this. One of the great issues is once you have diesel everywhere, to switch to natural gas and to have natural gas pumping station, compression stations all over the US. It's just a lot of infrastructure to switch everything at once. There's a lot of scales of efficiency when you have one type of fuel. Next. So Amtrak, so America Track, was founded in 1971. It's a quasi-private entity slash government. It's really in this odd entity in the U.S. Because the freight railroads did not want to operate passengers. You don't make money operating passengers in the U.S. except for small little areas. But the U.S. government didn't want to lose passenger service, so they created Amtrak, and Amtrak operates passenger cars on freight uh, rail. So they own a very small section of rail, and it's called the Northeast Corridor. Basically, New York down to D.C. is the part that Amtrak actually owns, and that part of their portfolio is profitable, but the rest of the U.S. is not really profitable towards Amtrak, and there's a lot of delays associated with moving this far of a distance. Um, just you got to remember that most of the population's on the East Coast. It's very dense there, and it's very dense right on the West Coast. But in between, there's not much there, and it's very difficult to make sure that you arrive on time. Amtrak is notorious for being slow, but in 2018 they served about 32 million passengers. But there's a lot of issues with Amtrak that it's federally subsidized because it's taking on a lot of routes that are just not profitable. But the U.S. has decided that it doesn't want to not have those routes anymore. All right. So next, and we'll start talking about some railroad slang, things you probably don't hear very often, if frankly ever. Um, I still catch myself using this one. Bad order is basically a crippled car or locomotive. You could refer to it as a cripple, but no one actually ever does. You basically mark it with the big yellow tag that you see in the top left corner. Bad order, and you put the reason why. You put your name. This could be because it's unsafe to operate. The brakes don't work. The ladder's bent. It could be anything. It just means that there's something wrong with that freight car. The air brakes testing could be out of date and they haven't been tested within a year. Um, the term bandwagon was actually a pay car or a pay train where the railroad employees would actually get paid by their employer, the railroad. So the bandwagon was actually about getting money. Black Snake, you can kind of see that here. It's a solid train of coal cars. So this is a very famous curve. It's called the Horseshoe Curve. This is in Altoona, Pennsylvania. There was a lot of concern during World War II that the Germans were going to try to bomb this because a lot of freight had to move over this area because this is how you got freight over the Appalachian Mountains. And this was one of the few places you can see the front of the train and the end of the train in one section. So essentially, that freight car, that train is 150 cars and about a mile long. Some other terms, a bleed, which means drain air, because to get the brakes to fully release, you sometimes have to drain the individual air reservoir on every single freight car or locomotive. Next. So some slang, blow smoke means to brag. This used to be a lot of the old steam engines back in the day, bellowing smoke. Also, the diesel locomotives tend to produce a lot of very black smoke when they first start. The bullpen is the crew room where the crew just sits and gets ready to be called out. If you bump somebody, this goes to the union uh, who has seniority, and you basically say, "I have more seniority than you. I'm going to take this job because I think it's easier, or it's going to pay better, or whatever." Is the reason why you're invoking your seniority as a union person. A car knocker, basically, this is referred to as a carman, or which is sexist in this day and age. So it's essentially a car inspector who takes care of freight cars. This is an old picture of a old car knocker actually having to lubricate the old bearings back in the day. Now you no longer have to do this because the new ones are sealed. But back in the day, they used to actually have to go and tap them to see if there was oil needed or not. Casey Jones is a very famous railroad story, but we won't get in that to that today. But it's referred to as locomotive engineer Casey Jones. Go on. Next. Dead man switch. So every locomotive has a switch on it that every minute, I believe, it requires to be hit, or else the whole locomotive will shut down and brakes will apply. Um, it's fantastic fail safe to keep freight trains in control. Highball. A lot of people think that's a uh, drinking glass. It's actually a signal to say come ahead at full speed ahead, or you're good to go. They actually used to raise little tiny red ball onto like a flagpole, and that was the high ball to say you're good to go before they came up with the whole electric lights and switches. Hobo, tramp. This was a lot of vagrants. A lot of people wanted to explore the country. This is a picture of a stereotypical hobo. Whether or not it came from Hello Boy or some other um, origin, I cannot tell you the truth. But there used to be a lot of people riding the rails, trying to get from A to B. But you really never knew where you were going to end up. And there used to be a lot of railroad police to drive people off that were riding this. A hostler. This is an employee, usually somebody that services the engines. They move engines around in the yard, and their term is a hostler, something you don't hear every day. Next. Hotbox. So the bearings that you saw the car knocker hitting up and oiling, uh, basically, if those don't have the proper amount of oil, they can overheat, catch fire, and derail a whole train. So they actually have these things called hotbox detectors that scan a train as it goes by to see if something is too hot, if something failed, to stop the train, to inspect the cars to make sure that you're not going to cause derailment. Iron horse, that's just the locomotive. Horsepower. They had tons of it back in the day. Rip track, repair track. This is where you fix all the cars that are in bad order status. Rule G. So the Department of Transportation, because of all the derailments back in the day of hitting um, uh, vehicles and crossings. They outlawed all narcotics. Typically, to drive in the U.S., you have to be able to have less than 0.08%. But because this is a Department of Transportation ruling, you cannot have any. So if you blew a 0.01% blood alcohol content, you were immediately fired. Scab, this goes to union workmen. So in non-union workmen, when railroads, used to go on strike, the railroads would bring in scab labor to keep the trains running, and the union workers did not like that and came up with the name scab. You can see a picture in the lower right-hand corner. This is referred to as the truck. This is what every freight car sits on. It's just wheels and springs essentially, just to let the whatever you're hauling, move down the tracks. So that's it for me in my presentation. Does anyone have any more questions, thoughts, concerns? I could
Um,
talk about the railroad much all day.
and often do. I
Yeah.
kid, of course. Jordan, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. That was really excellent. I mean, few topics conjure the imagination as much as the railroad, particularly in American society, where it really holds an almost mythical place. So it's fantastic. We got a chance to learn a little bit about how it actually works, how it came to be. I had a question, actually, a few, and very happy to take other questions from the audience. So if anybody writes one, I will read it to Jordan. But you said that the U.S. time zones, the four time zones that make up the continental United States, came about because of the railroad. Were these the first time zones in
They
the
were the
world?
first time zones in the U.S. Because back in the day, pretty much every city had its own clock, its own time, and like the mayor set its own time. Railroads couldn't really operate like that. They needed to, be from A to B, and they only had the one track when they first had this. So you had two-way traffic trying to go down one track. So you often had to put one car into a siding. So if you were supposed to leave the city at 3 o'clock and you actually left at 3:30, you could possibly hit a train coming in the other side that was supposed to go into the siding, and you just ran into each other. So yes, the time zones were created in the U.S. I don't know if they were the first time zones, but they really created the standardization of time in the U.S.
Oh,
Because
that's
before
fantastic.
everyone just did their own thing.
I see you also said that a ton of freight can be transported on the railroad on a gallon of fuel. I don't know what gallon is in liters, but which we probably should have converted. But never
Yeah,
mind. But the
I have
idea
converted.
is that is incredibly efficient. Do you know what the comparable figure for say a semi trailer would be?
Um, it's I would say it's at least 4 times higher.
Really?
Um, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but basically what they do is they just every year the railroads know how much tonnage they moved and how far they moved it, and they just divide by how much fuel they purchased for the year. But it's been slowly increasing every year based on more efficient locomotives being used.
Have they lengthened the number of cars or increased the number of cars that they're towing on a route as well?
So some routes you can do that. Out west, you can do that. On the East Coast, it's much harder because the sidings were made a certain length. So for safety reasons, you can never build a train longer than your sidings. Because if anything happens, that train is stuck on your main line, and you won't be able to move anything till you get it off of there and into a rail yard and break it up. But out west, where they're not as constrained, they do make longer and longer trains. Some of them are a mile and a half long.
No,
And
that's
the Pacific and Burlington Northern get a lot more efficiencies that way, because they can build longer and longer trains. Um, One interesting thing that they end up having to do, though, is because the trains get so long, you actually have to distribute your power. So you don't have just like three locomotives in the front. You have two locomotives in the front and like one in the middle, so that the forces of being pulled, because you have to pull every single freight car to the one in the back. So then it gets this impact, and you can pull out your coupler and your cushion unit. So you really have to distribute that force equally throughout your train so that you don't tear up your own equipment.
Oh, that's interesting. You spoke a little bit about the different types of rails that had been in use before and how they hadn't been uniform. And I know that in the UK versus, I don't know if it was continental Europe or maybe just the former Soviet Union, they had different gauges, and
Mm-hmm.
the trains had to be lifted up and adjusted to go on to different types of tracks. Is there now worldwide a uniform type of
There,
track?
there is a stand. There every region essentially created their own standard. I believe there's a standard gauge in China. There's a standard gauge in Russia. There's a standard gauge in the North America. Um, Basically, anywhere that you would have to interchange, freight cars and locomotives. Um, but one I really don't think there is a standard gauge. I think there's just regional standardizations. One thing that's interesting with how it works in the US now is, say you have 150 cars that came to port in California, Burlington Northern pulls them to Chicago, and these are all destinations like Philly. So then CSX will just put their train crew on the Burlington Northern locomotives and just haul them straight as is. They won't even change their locomotives. So there's an agreement between all the railroads, like, hey, at the end of the year, we'll settle up. If you borrowed, one 6,000 horsepower locomotive for a week, and then I can borrow two 3,000 horsepowers for a week, and they just at the end of the year they settle up horsepower hours, just because they don't want to stop and change the locomotives. They want, and the same with the freight cars and the end of train devices. Basically, there's an agreement of what this costs, and they just share the resources to keep everything operating as efficiently as possible.
No, that's remarkable. So they're so complementary that a crew from Burlington Northern can get on a CSX train and know exactly where the switches are.
Yeah, so basically every crew only operates that section of track. So they operate from, say, Richmond to DC, and they'll do that their whole life. They'll never go anywhere else. But that train will switch crews, 20 times across the US. But each crew only has a section that they are certified on, and they don't just ride the rails to the end destination. And basically, that distance is limited by the Department of Transportation's hours of service rules. You can only operate for 12 hours. You can only be on duty for 12 hours. And the thought is that you'll be too tired to operate things safely if you exceed the 12-hour
That
rules.
makes sense. In the airline industry, I know that the aircraft will have a crew rest area where the pilots who are off duty will go sleep. I don't suppose they have a cabin on board the
Uh,
locomotives, do they?
Cabin on board, but basically every railroad has basically their own fleet of vehicles to then grab the crew and take them to hotels. So there's hotel agreements all over the U.S. to put the crew in a hotel for the night, and then they get on the next train, go back to the yard that they came from the previous day. So one day at home, one day in a hotel, one day at home, one day in a hotel.
Oh, interesting. Will they so they'll deadhead
Yeah,
back to
so
their home?
occasionally they will. When they're needed. They don't like to deadhead because they would rather you be pulling the freight yourself. So they will basically just send you with a train from A to B and send you back in a different loaded train from B to A. Because they don't want you just riding a train for free, because that's wasted hours they're paying you.
Right. That makes sense. Um, sort of off the wall question, but are there any dual use trains? Do you have combis that are part passenger, part freight?
Um, no. Um, well, every freight railroad has their own luxury passenger cars, but they don't mix these with the rest of the freight cars. So they will, when they want to show off to somebody, they will, um, bring a governor on board to see their tracks and their states, and have a wining and dining car, and there'll be sleepers, and they use these, and they call them the presidential trains. Historically, the U.S. always had a presidential train, where either FDR was giving speeches off the back, or Lincoln. And you can actually, there was a lot of presidents, when they died in office, they were put on a train, and that was a big thing to come see and pay your respects as the train went past to where the president was going to be buried. When George Bush died, Union Pacific, um, I believe Union Pacific actually carried his body part of the way and renamed a locomotive in honor of him. But it's still very much, especially in the Texas culture, that you do this.
Did people line the tracks to bid farewell to
There,
President Bush?
yes. So there's a lot of people that are just so nostalgic about the train industry in the U.S. Um, we refer to them as foamers because they foamed at the mouth because they were so enthusiastic about this.
Sure, they
There's
appreciate
hair
that.
that bring out like historic steam locomotives and historic passenger cars, and they do passenger train runs throughout the U.S. occasionally. And you will see somebody, well, not somebody, you'll see a dozen people on these trains following it and going from crossing to crossing just to take its picture again and again and again, looking for that perfect shot.
Have you ever had the opportunity to ride in one of the presidential fancy cars?
I got to ride on a historic car, not a presidential car, but I did get to go on the presidential car when it was just sitting in the yard. So I did get to go on it and go through it, because in Altoona, Pennsylvania, part of outside the Horseshoe Curve is a large shop where they actually remanufacture and update those cars. They have a very well stocked bar in those cars, I will say, and they're beautiful on the
Good to
inside.
know. Good to know. Did you catch 40 winks? Did you take your time about moving through it,
I
or were you
took my
also?
time. I took a lot of pictures. Yes.
Well, you have to show them to us. Maybe at your next Virtual American Roadshow presentation, you can favor us with a few pictures of that. Um, well, we are running quickly out of time. I see we have several people who've greeted you. We've only had the one question. Just a last question. Are there any comparisons you could draw between the Azerbaijani freight system? I know that's possibly unfair. I know you haven't had a chance to make a deep study of it, but any
Um,
any similarities or market differences between the system in the United States and here in Azerbaijan?
from what I've seen, the signaling seems to be more manual and going over with radios. I'm assuming to put down little gates and barriers to stop vehicles crossing at the where a train would go by. The Azerbaijanis tend, from what I've seen by the highway, they use the electric overhead to power the locomotive, so they're not using refined diesel or anything else to pull that. And the coupler system appears to be more what's in tuned with Europe than rather the US for the actual car connections. The trains seem to be pretty short here in comparison to the US, but I don't really know what they're hauling because the US, we haul pretty much anything and everything because it's so cheap as compared to trucking for the long distances. Um, that's pretty much all I've seen from the Azeri. I've never gotten on an Azeri train or freight car yet. It's on my bucket list.
We'll have to see if we can make that happen. In any case, this has been extremely interesting for me, and I'm sure that people who've watched as well will have you have one last chance to ask Jordan a question about the U.S. freight rail system. Otherwise, we'll say goodnight to you. Thank you for joining us, and above all, thank Jordan for coming. So, anyone going once, going twice? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jordan. That was fascinating. We will soon have another Virtual American Roadshow. One of our other American officers, Lucy Reyno, is going to be talking about the American tradition of volunteerism. So we hope you'll join us for that. That we'll be posting the schedule for that in the American Center, the Buckham American Center Facebook page. So please keep consulting that. But for now, Jordan, thanks very much. Lovely to learn a little bit more about the U.S. freight system. Bye, everybody. Good night.